HOA tried to fine me $500 for my front door color. Big mistake. Chapter 1: The New Door. It all started with something as simple and innocent as a door. After years of living in a modest suburban home, the narrator decided it was finally time to refresh the entrance. The old wooden door had seen better days. Its paint had chipped, the hinges creaked whenever it opened, and the weather had left it with warped edges that let in too much cold air during winter and too much heat during summer. The decision was easy: a new door, one that was sturdy, secure, and brought a little charm to the house. After weeks of browsing through hardware stores and online catalogs, the perfect one was found: a smooth, modern door in a deep shade of forest green. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't neon. It wasn't loud or tacky. It was a classy, timeless color that blended with the lush trees in the yard and added a welcoming touch. For the narrator and their family, it felt like the perfect choice. The installation went smoothly, and by the end of the weekend, the new door was in place. Neighbors walking by complimented it, saying how nice it looked and how it gave the home a fresh, updated appeal. The narrator felt proud. Finally, something in the home reflected their own taste and personality. But little did they know, that very door would soon ignite a battle with the neighborhood's homeowners association, one that would spiral far beyond a simple paint color. It happened a few days later. While sipping coffee in the kitchen, the narrator noticed an envelope tucked under the front mat. It wasn't the usual junk mail or local flyer. It had the HOA's logo neatly printed at the top. Inside was a typed letter, cold and bureaucratic in tone. It began with a notice of violation. The offense? The newly installed front door was painted a non-approved color that does not align with the community's aesthetic guidelines. The letter concluded with a fine of $500, payable within 30 days, or further penalties would follow. The narrator was stunned. Forest green was hardly outrageous. It wasn't as though the door had been painted bright pink or spray-painted with graffiti. It was simple, tasteful, and matched the home's exterior. Still, the HOA had declared it an offense. Confusion quickly turned into frustration. How could such a trivial detail warrant a $500 fine? And why was this the first time anyone had ever heard of such a rule? Surely there were bigger issues in the neighborhood than the color of a single front door. The narrator walked around the neighborhood to clear their head, paying closer attention to other homes. To their surprise, there were several houses with doors painted in bold shades: a bright red door 2 streets over, a deep navy blue door across the cul-de-sac, even a cheerful yellow one that practically glowed in the sun. None of those seemed to be under attack. Why was the green door suddenly a problem? The realization began to sink in. Either the HOA had singled them out, or there was something more personal at play. A hidden agenda, perhaps, or a power-hungry board member who simply wanted to flex authority. Whatever the case, the fine was unjust, and the narrator knew they couldn't just pay it quietly. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about principle. Over the following days, the narrator began gathering information. They pulled out the HOA's official rulebook, flipping through page after page of dense language about landscaping, mailboxes, roofing materials, and approved paint swatches. There it was, buried deep in the section on exterior modifications, a vague line stating that all exterior changes, including paint colors, must be approved by the board prior to installation. No specific list of approved colors. No clear restrictions. Just a blanket statement that could be twisted to fit whatever the HOA wanted. Armed with this knowledge, the narrator felt the first spark of determination. The door wasn't just a door anymore. It had become a battleground, a symbol of standing up to overreach and pettiness. If the HOA wanted a fight, they would get one, but not in the way they expected. By the end of the week, the narrator had drafted an appeal letter. It was professional but firm, pointing out the vagueness of the rules and the inconsistency in enforcement. The letter highlighted the many colorful doors throughout the neighborhood and questioned why those had been allowed without penalty. It concluded with a demand to rescind the fine, citing unfair treatment. The letter was dropped off at the HOA office with a sense of quiet triumph. The narrator knew this was only the beginning. But they also knew something the HOA didn't. Once challenged, they weren't someone who backed down easily. The days ticked by slowly after that. Neighbors whispered about the situation, some offering support, others too afraid to get involved. Then, almost a week later, another envelope arrived in the mailbox. The return address once again bore the HOA logo. With tense anticipation, the narrator tore it open. Instead of rescinding the fine, the HOA doubled down. The letter dismissed the appeal entirely, stating that the board had reviewed the case and determined the violation still stood. Not only that, but the fine had now increased to $750 due to failure to comply. The narrator's jaw dropped. What had started as a $500 penalty for something harmless had escalated into a bigger financial threat. The HOA clearly thought intimidation would make them fold. But they had miscalculated. This only fueled the narrator's resolve. If the HOA thought they could bully one homeowner into submission, they were about to learn a hard lesson. A plan began to form, one that would not only clear the narrator's name but also expose the HOA's hypocrisy for the entire community to see. And so, the battle over a single green door had officially begun. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, The Escalation. The second letter from the HOA marked a turning point. What had begun as disbelief quickly transformed into resolve. The fine was no longer about the shade of green on a door. It was about power, control, and intimidation. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was flexing authority to see who would break first. And the narrator had no intention of breaking. But standing up to an HOA is never simple. They had resources, a board of members, and the ability to levy fines and legal threats at will. To fight back meant being strategic, careful, and, above all, relentless. The first step was research. Every spare moment became dedicated to poring over the HOA's governing documents, bylaws, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Each page revealed more loopholes, contradictions, and vague phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The narrator began highlighting passages, making notes, and cross-referencing sections. What quickly became clear was that the HOA thrived on homeowners not knowing their rights. The rules were written in a way that allowed selective enforcement. In other words, they punished whoever they wanted, while conveniently ignoring others. The more the narrator studied, the angrier they became. That bright red door a few streets away? Not approved. That sunny yellow door across the cul-de-sac? Not approved either. Yet, no fines had been issued there. The hypocrisy was undeniable. At the same time, the narrator began documenting everything. Photographs of other homes with colorful doors were taken, catalogued, and dated. Notes were kept on every communication from the HOA, with copies of each letter carefully filed away. Neighbors who had once mentioned frustrations with the HOA were quietly approached, and their stories were recorded too. Tales of unfair fines, selective enforcement, and board members bending rules for themselves started to pile up. The narrator realized this wasn't just their battle. It was the entire neighborhood's struggle, and most people had simply been too intimidated to push back. Still, despite gathering evidence, the pressure mounted. Another week passed, and a third letter arrived, this one more threatening than the last. It warned that if the fine wasn't paid within 2 weeks, legal action could be pursued, and a lien could be placed on the home. The words were crafted to scare, and for most people, they would have worked. But instead of fear, the narrator felt something else, a spark of determination so strong it eclipsed the anxiety. It was time to go public. The narrator began drafting a letter, not to the HOA board this time, but to the entire community. In calm, professional language, the letter explained the situation: a $500 fine over a harmless green door, the rejection of appeals, and the escalating penalties. Attached were photographs of other doors in the neighborhood, all in non-approved colors, yet untouched by fines. The letter asked one simple question: why was this enforcement selective? Dozens of copies were made and slipped discreetly into mailboxes late one evening. By the next morning, whispers spread like wildfire. Homeowners began approaching the narrator with quiet nods of support, some even sharing their own frustrations aloud now that someone else had taken the first step. The HOA board didn't appreciate the exposure. Within days, another letter arrived, this time dripping with hostility. It accused the narrator of spreading misinformation and undermining the authority of the board. The fines remained, and now the threat of legal costs was added to the mix. But something had shifted. For the first time, the narrator wasn't alone. Other homeowners began emailing the board, questioning their practices. A few even attended the next HOA meeting, voicing complaints that had long been bottled up. The board, accustomed to ruling without challenge, was suddenly on the defensive. Still, the narrator knew exposure alone wasn't enough. The board was stubborn, and their pride was now on the line. They would dig in, hoping to outlast the resistance. To truly win, the narrator needed something stronger than community support. They needed a weapon the HOA couldn't ignore. That's when the idea of legal consultation emerged. With a folder full of evidence, letters, photographs, and documented inconsistencies, the narrator scheduled an appointment with a property law attorney. The meeting was eye-opening. The attorney carefully reviewed the documents, nodding as they flipped through the pages. Finally, they looked up and confirmed what the narrator had suspected all along: the HOA was operating outside the bounds of its own authority. The vague wording in the bylaws? A major weakness. The selective enforcement? Clear evidence of discrimination. And the threats of liens and legal action over something so trivial? Potentially unenforceable. The attorney explained that, if challenged, the HOA could face serious legal repercussions, not only having the fine overturned but also being forced to pay damages and fees. The narrator left that office with more than just advice. They left with ammunition. The HOA thought they had cornered a homeowner with no options. Instead, they had awakened someone willing to fight back with the law on their side. But rather than rush into battle immediately, the narrator decided to let the pressure build. They would allow the HOA to think they had won, to escalate further, to entangle themselves even deeper in their own web of overreach. Because when the counterstrike came, it would land harder than anyone on the board could imagine. The following days were a tense waiting game. The narrator kept their calm demeanor, continuing daily life as if nothing had changed. Neighbors continued to show quiet support, whispering updates about how furious the board had been at the last meeting. The HOA believed they were holding all the cards. But soon, they were about to learn that they weren't the only ones who knew how to play the game. The door stood proudly, its forest green paint shining in the afternoon sun. To the narrator, it was no longer just a decoration. It was a symbol of defiance, a constant reminder of the fight they had chosen. And as the HOA prepared its next move, the narrator was ready. Because what the board didn't know yet was that every unfair fine, every vague rule, and every act of hypocrisy was about to be turned against them in ways they never expected. The battle lines had been drawn. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. The green door had become more than just an entrance to the narrator's home. It had become a lightning rod for attention, controversy, and defiance. While neighbors admired it quietly, the HOA board saw it as a direct challenge to their authority. And authority was something they were determined to protect at all costs. 2 weeks after the last threatening letter, another notice arrived. This time, it wasn't just a fine or a warning. It was a formal notice of pending lien placement. The board claimed that because the fine had not been paid, they had the legal right to secure the debt against the property. To any homeowner unfamiliar with HOA tactics, it would have been terrifying, a threat to their very home. But to the narrator, it was exactly what they had been waiting for. Because this time, the HOA had gone too far. The narrator already had advice from a property attorney, who had explained in detail that the board couldn't arbitrarily place liens without following proper procedure. And in this case, the HOA hadn't followed procedure at all. The vague bylaws, the selective enforcement, the refusal to rescind despite obvious inconsistencies, all of it had created a perfect storm of evidence. By pushing too aggressively, the HOA had stepped over a legal line. Still, before taking action, the narrator decided to let the pressure build even further. They quietly filed away the new letter, adding it to the growing stack of documentation. By now, the folder was thick with evidence, copies of every notice, photographs of other non-approved doors, and written statements from supportive neighbors. It wasn't just a folder anymore, it was a case file. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to change. The narrator noticed more and more homeowners showing small acts of rebellion. One neighbor replaced their plain white curtains with patterned ones visible from the street, something the HOA had quietly discouraged for years. Another parked a camper van in their driveway for the weekend, despite the rulebook forbidding long-term storage of recreational vehicles. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate signs that the community had grown tired of being controlled. The narrator's battle over a door had inspired others to push back in their own ways. The HOA board, however, wasn't blind to the shift. At the next meeting, word spread that the president had been livid, accusing certain residents of stirring up dissent. The tension between the board and the homeowners was palpable, with whispers of special assessments and stricter enforcement to restore order. Instead of maintaining harmony, the board's heavy-handedness was fracturing the very community it was supposed to protect. One evening, a neighbor stopped by quietly. They had lived in the community for over a decade and knew the HOA's inner workings better than most. In hushed tones, they revealed a bombshell. One of the board members, the same one who had likely pushed hardest for the fine, had once painted their own garage door without approval. Not only that, but they had fought tooth and nail to avoid penalties, eventually persuading the rest of the board to look the other way. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a board member who had benefited from selective enforcement, now punishing others for the very same thing. The narrator felt both anger and satisfaction. This was the kind of evidence that could dismantle the board's credibility once and for all. Armed with this knowledge, the narrator met with the attorney again. Together, they outlined a strategy, not just to fight the fine, but to expose the entire pattern of abuse. The attorney explained how homeowner associations often relied on fear and silence, assuming no one would challenge them. But when someone did, and when evidence was presented in a structured legal manner, HOAs could crumble under the weight of their own overreach. The plan was clear. The narrator would file a formal complaint, supported by the evidence they had gathered. The complaint would not only challenge the fine but also accuse the board of selective enforcement and misuse of authority. If successful, it could result in the fine being overturned, damages awarded, and even potential removal of certain board members. But there was one more step before launching the complaint. The narrator wanted to give the HOA a chance to back down voluntarily. It wasn't out of kindness, it was a calculated move. By giving them one last opportunity to rescind the fine, the narrator would prove to any outsider that they had acted reasonably at every stage. The refusal, when it inevitably came, would only strengthen the case. So another letter was drafted, carefully worded with the attorney's guidance. It outlined the selective enforcement, referenced the numerous other unapproved doors, and hinted at the knowledge of a board member's own violation. It concluded with a firm deadline: rescind the fine within 10 days, or the matter would be escalated to legal authorities. The letter was delivered by certified mail, ensuring there could be no denial of receipt. Then came the waiting. Days passed with no response. The HOA board had gone unusually quiet, and neighbors speculated that heated arguments were taking place behind closed doors. Some said the president wanted to dig in deeper, while others suggested that a few members were starting to worry about exposure. Finally, on the 9th day, a response arrived. The envelope bore the HOA's logo, but its tone was different from the others. It was shorter, colder, and dripping with arrogance. The fine would not be rescinded. The board insisted that rules were rules, and any further attempts to challenge them would be met with swift and decisive action. The narrator smiled as they read it. The board had done exactly what was expected. They had doubled down once again, blind to the trap being laid. The next step was clear. The case file was complete, the deadline had passed, and the HOA had chosen its path. Now, the narrator would escalate things beyond the board's control. The door still stood proud in its forest green shade, untouched and unrepentant. It wasn't just an entryway anymore, it was a declaration of independence, a challenge to unjust authority, and a symbol of what was about to unfold. Because with the refusal letter in hand, the narrator knew the time had finally come to strike back. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, Turning the Tables. The refusal letter from the HOA was the final straw. For weeks, the narrator had endured fines, threats, and intimidation, all stemming from a harmless green door. Each time, the board doubled down, certain that sheer persistence and pressure would force compliance. But with this last rejection, they had walked straight into the trap. The narrator gathered every piece of evidence, photographs, letters, testimonies, and the damning information about the board member's own violation, and met once again with the attorney. Together, they prepared a formal legal complaint. It was not written in the emotional, frustrated tone of a homeowner fed up with harassment. No, it was precise, factual, and professional, laying out point by point how the HOA had failed in its duties, overstepped its authority, and selectively enforced its rules. The complaint highlighted the vague language of the bylaws, noting the absence of an approved color list. It emphasized the existence of multiple homes with non-approved doors, none of which had received fines. And it called out the hypocrisy of the board member who had painted their garage door without approval, only to escape consequences because of insider privilege. The piece de resistance was the claim that the board's threats of liens and legal action over such a minor issue could be considered harassment and abuse of power under state property law. The attorney filed the complaint, and suddenly the narrative shifted. For the first time, the HOA was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. Within days, the board received notice of the legal filing. Panic began to ripple through their ranks. Meetings grew more frantic, neighbors whispered about shouting matches between board members, and rumors spread that some were considering resigning before the situation spiraled further. The board president, however, remained defiant, declaring that the HOA would fight this baseless attack to the very end. But bravado wasn't enough to mask the cracks forming in their authority. Meanwhile, the narrator stayed calm. For the first time in months, they felt the pressure lifting. The battle was no longer one-sided. Now it was a contest of evidence, credibility, and law, and the narrator's side was stronger on all three counts. As the legal process unfolded, the narrator also took another step: transparency. They began quietly sharing updates with neighbors, not in a gossipy or inflammatory way, but as a factual timeline of events. Copies of the HOA's threatening letters were shown. Photographs of other non-approved doors were circulated. Even the board's own hypocrisy was hinted at without names being directly mentioned. Slowly but surely, the community's perception shifted. Where once the HOA's word had gone unchallenged, now doubt took root. People began asking themselves, if the board could target someone over a door color, who might be next? Then came the first hearing. It was informal, a chance for both sides to present preliminary arguments before the case proceeded further. The narrator arrived with their attorney, calm and prepared. Across the room, the HOA president and two board members sat stiffly, clutching folders of their own. The contrast was striking. While the narrator's evidence was organized, consistent, and supported by law, the board's arguments seemed emotional and flimsy. They insisted the fine was valid because the bylaws required approval for all exterior changes. But when asked to produce a list of approved door colors, they had none. When asked why other colorful doors had not been fined, they stumbled over excuses about overlooked enforcement and recent policy changes. And when confronted with the board member's own violation, they shifted uncomfortably, unable to provide a satisfactory explanation. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day, but the writing was on the wall. The HOA had walked in confident and walked out shaken. News spread quickly after the hearing. Neighbors who had been hesitant to take sides now began openly questioning the board's actions. Some even offered to testify on the narrator's behalf, sharing their own experiences of inconsistent fines and intimidation. The board's grip on the community was slipping, and for the first time, they knew it. But the narrator wasn't finished. With the attorney's guidance, they filed a motion not only to dismiss the fine but also to seek reimbursement for legal fees and damages. If successful, the HOA wouldn't just lose the case, they would be forced to pay out of their own budget. And that budget came directly from homeowner dues. The irony was delicious. The board's stubbornness might cost them the very support of the people they claimed to represent. The pressure grew unbearable for the HOA. At the next community meeting, which was usually sparsely attended, dozens of homeowners showed up. Some came out of curiosity, others out of frustration, and many simply wanted to see what would happen next. The room buzzed with tension as the president attempted to maintain control, rattling off routine updates about landscaping and maintenance. But no one cared about landscaping. They wanted answers. One by one, homeowners began asking questions. Why was the board spending time and money harassing someone over a door color when so many bigger issues, potholes, security, landscaping, were being neglected? Why had other homes been overlooked while one was targeted so aggressively? Why was the HOA willing to risk the community's budget on a legal fight it was likely to lose? The board tried to dodge, but the pressure mounted until finally, the president snapped, lashing out at the narrator directly. That outburst was the moment the room turned. People saw the truth with their own eyes. The board wasn't protecting the community. They were protecting their own pride. The meeting ended in chaos, with homeowners demanding accountability and board members retreating to closed-door discussions. The once powerful HOA had never looked weaker. Back home, the narrator sat quietly at their kitchen table, sipping tea while the forest green door stood proudly at the front of the house. What had started as a small personal project had spiraled into a battle for fairness, and now victory felt closer than ever. But the fight wasn't over yet. The final ruling still loomed, and with it, the chance to not only clear the narrator's name but to permanently reshape the power dynamics of the neighborhood. The board was cornered, desperate, and unpredictable. And everyone knew, when power begins to slip, those who cling to it will make their most reckless moves. The narrator braced themselves. The storm was about to reach its peak. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, The Showdown. The weeks leading up to the final hearing were tense. For months, the HOA had played the role of aggressor, issuing threats, fines, and warnings with smug confidence. But now, their grip was slipping. The community's faith in the board was fractured, their credibility was under attack, and the looming legal case threatened to expose every inconsistency they had tried to hide. The narrator could feel the desperation in the air. Board members, once aloof and untouchable, were suddenly seen walking door to door, attempting to reassure homeowners that the situation was under control. They framed it as a minor dispute being blown out of proportion, but few believed them anymore. The truth had already spread too far. Still, the HOA president wasn't ready to back down. Pride had become their anchor, and they were determined to drag the entire community through the mud rather than admit defeat. That arrogance would prove to be their undoing. The day of the hearing finally arrived. Unlike the preliminary session, this one was formal. The outcome would carry legal weight, with rulings that neither side could ignore. The narrator arrived early, dressed professionally, accompanied by their attorney. They carried the now thick folder of evidence, every page neatly organized and ready to be presented. Across the room, the HOA president sat stiffly at a long table with 2 board members and a hired attorney of their own. Their expressions were tight, betraying the tension beneath their composed facades. They had convinced themselves they were fighting for principle, but deep down, they knew the ground beneath them was crumbling. The hearing began. The HOA's attorney went first, reciting the board's argument. The bylaws required prior approval for all exterior changes, including paint colors, and the homeowner had failed to seek that approval. Therefore, the fine was justified. It sounded neat on paper, but the holes in the argument were obvious. When asked to provide the list of approved colors, the HOA admitted that none existed. When pressed about other doors in the neighborhood painted in non-approved shades, they dismissed them as oversights or pending enforcement. But no records of enforcement existed. Their claims unraveled further when confronted with testimony from neighbors who confirmed they had never sought approval for their own door colors, and had never been fined. Then came the turning point. The narrator's attorney presented the evidence of a sitting board member who had painted their garage door without approval years earlier. A photograph was produced, timestamped and dated, showing the unapproved modification. A copy of old meeting minutes was also presented, documenting a discussion where the violation had been quietly brushed aside. The room grew still. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised. The hypocrisy was undeniable. If the board had excused one of their own for the exact same violation, how could they now claim authority to fine others? The HOA's president tried to speak, but the words fell flat. Their explanations sounded hollow, excuses strung together in a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The more they spoke, the weaker their position became. When it was the narrator's turn, the attorney spoke clearly and confidently. They outlined the selective enforcement, the vague bylaws, the intimidation tactics, and the threats of liens that went beyond the board's actual authority. They emphasized that the issue wasn't the color of the door, it was the abuse of power. The judge nodded slowly, taking notes. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA had not only mishandled the situation but had acted in bad faith, targeting one homeowner while ignoring countless others. By the end of the session, the outcome was obvious to everyone in the room. The fine would not hold. But the judge went further. In a firm ruling, they declared the fine null and void, ordered the HOA to reimburse the homeowner's legal fees, and issued a warning to the board about the dangers of selective enforcement and abuse of authority. The ruling was a public rebuke, one that left the board humiliated and weakened. The narrator walked out of the courthouse with a sense of triumph. The green door had stood the test of intimidation, and now it stood as a symbol of victory. Neighbors congratulated them, some openly expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to the board. But the story wasn't over yet. Because while the legal case had been resolved, the damage to the HOA's reputation was permanent. Word spread quickly throughout the community, and the fallout began almost immediately. Some homeowners demanded resignations from the board. Others began pushing for a recall election to remove the president entirely. The once powerful board found itself cornered, scrambling to retain control. Meetings that had once been dull and sparsely attended now overflowed with angry residents demanding accountability. The board's iron grip had turned to dust. For the narrator, victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about personal pride. It was about proving a point, that homeowners didn't have to bow to unjust authority. That rules could not be twisted to serve personal agendas. And that sometimes, all it took was one person willing to say no to change the entire dynamic of a community. At home, the green door gleamed in the afternoon sun. Every time the narrator walked through it, they were reminded of the journey, of the stress, the threats, the sleepless nights, but also of the determination, the courage, and the ultimate triumph. The HOA had underestimated them. They had thought a $500 fine would break their spirit. Instead, it had ignited a rebellion. But even with the legal battle won, one question lingered: what would happen next? Would the board cling to power, or would the community finally take back control? The storm had passed, but the aftermath was only just beginning. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, Aftermath and Reckoning. The courtroom ruling had been decisive. The fine was voided, legal fees were ordered to be reimbursed, and the HOA board had been given a stern warning about selective enforcement. On paper, the battle was over. But in reality, the real storm was only beginning. Word of the ruling spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once whispered in hushed tones about their frustrations now spoke openly. People compared notes, realizing just how many had been quietly fined or threatened over minor infractions while others had been allowed to skate by unchallenged. The ruling had cracked open the facade, and behind it lay years of resentment and mistrust. The HOA president tried to contain the fallout, but their authority was gone. No amount of bluster could undo what had happened in that courtroom. Homeowners now questioned every word, every decision, every so-called rule the board attempted to enforce. Meetings that had once been sparsely attended were now packed with residents, voices raised, demanding transparency and accountability. The narrator attended one of these meetings a week after the ruling. The atmosphere was electric. Neighbors who had once seemed indifferent were now emboldened. They wanted answers. Why had money been wasted on a fight that was doomed from the start? Why had the board targeted one homeowner while ignoring others? And, perhaps most damning of all, why had a sitting board member been allowed to violate rules without consequence? The board tried to defend itself, but the excuses sounded hollow. The president insisted they had only been upholding the community standards, but few believed it anymore. Standards meant nothing when applied selectively. Standards meant nothing when used as a weapon. One by one, homeowners called for resignations. Some demanded an emergency recall election. The board members sat stiffly, their confidence evaporating with each passing minute. Even those who had once stood firmly by the president began to falter under the weight of public anger. Eventually, it happened. The board president, red-faced and visibly shaken, announced they would be stepping down for the good of the community. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but everyone in the room knew the truth: they had been forced out. Their reign of intimidation was over. The resignation sparked a chain reaction. Other board members followed suit in the weeks that came, unable to withstand the scrutiny or the pressure. By the end of the month, nearly the entire board had been replaced. In their place came new representatives, ordinary homeowners who promised transparency, fairness, and a renewed focus on issues that actually mattered, like maintenance, safety, and community improvements. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt united. People who had once kept to themselves now spoke with one another at meetings, in driveways, and at block parties. What had once been a community ruled by fear became one empowered by accountability. The green door had become more than a symbol of defiance, it had become a symbol of change. The narrator, though never seeking the spotlight, couldn't escape it. Neighbors thanked them for standing up when no one else would. Some admitted they had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA, but seeing someone succeed gave them courage. Others simply nodded in appreciation, their relief plain to see. The narrator accepted the gratitude humbly, but privately, they reflected on the cost. The months of stress, the constant pressure, the uncertainty, it had been a heavy burden. But the victory, and the change it sparked, made it worth every sleepless night. With the legal battle behind them, life slowly returned to normal. The green door remained, untouched and unapologetic, its deep shade of forest green catching the light of each sunrise and sunset. Children rode bikes past it, neighbors walked their dogs, and visitors often paused to compliment its charm. To outsiders, it was just a door. But to those who knew the story, it was a monument. Still, there were quiet reminders of the past. A few former board loyalists grumbled about the troublemaker who had caused so much upheaval. They muttered that the neighborhood had lost its order, that things were better before. But their voices were few, drowned out by the overwhelming support of those who now felt free to live without the constant shadow of intimidation. Months later, the narrator found themselves reflecting on the journey. What had started with a simple home improvement project had spiraled into a full-scale battle of wills. The HOA had underestimated them, thinking a fine would force compliance. Instead, that arrogance had cost them everything. The lesson was clear: authority, when abused, will always collapse under its own weight. Rules, when applied unfairly, lose their legitimacy. And a community, when pushed too far, will always rise to demand better. The narrator smiled each time they passed through the green door. It was more than wood and paint, it was a reminder of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up when no one else will. The battle had been long, but the victory had reshaped not just one home, but an entire neighborhood. In the end, the HOA had tried to fine them $500 for a door. Instead, the HOA had paid a much heavier price: its credibility, its control, and its very leadership. And the narrator? They had gained something priceless: the knowledge that even the smallest act of defiance could spark the biggest change. The story closed not with bitterness, but with peace. The green door stood proudly, the community thrived, And the memory of the fight lived on as a warning to anyone who might ever try to misuse authority again. The battle was over. The lesson remained. End of chapter 6. The conclusion.